people who had to endure all the worst things they could and could not even imagine, and also people who saw the terrible consequences of these horrific events. If they managed to capture those who arranged all this, then it is not difficult to guess what is going to happen now. It really happened. 29th of April, 1945. Some participants do not regret what they did, and on the other hand, many felt guilty afterwards. Welcome to Ex-War History. Let us tell you about what exactly happened at Dachau concentration camp. A short history of Dachau. Places for isolating the undesirable population appeared in Germany immediately after the NSDAP began to rule. This was when Hitler was already leading the party in 1933. And after 4 years, so many undesirables were caught that ordinary prisons were not enough to contain them. Concentration camps appeared. They began to gain popularity in the first place in Austria-Hungary during the First World War, though the Dachau concentration camp grew up in Bavaria, near the beautiful town of the same name, only 16 kilometers from Munich. It was one of the first to be discovered on German soil. It was founded on March 22, 1937. The area is 20 acres. The place of its location is the territory of the former factory that made ammunition during the First World War, but was later closed at the insistence of the winners of this war. The camp appeared shortly after the Reichstag was set on fire. This gave the Nazis the opportunity to quickly eliminate their political enemies on the territory of Germany and Austria, which united in the Third Reich into an empire of Aryans, that is, superior people. Before the outbreak of World War II, even priests were added to the list of undesirables in Dachau. All pastors were against anti-Nazism. Such a motley composition of prisoners in all ways, socially, nationally, religiously, and mentally in general, was not found in any other death camp. The most curious point was that innocent Germans, disabled physically and mentally disabled, were supposed to be held here. And the construction of the camp, the working structure, the regime, and the goals themselves were planned by a real psycho, the future SS man Theodor Eicke. Before that, he had already been treated in various clinics for the abnormal behaviors, but nothing helped him. How did it happen? It's just that this psycho joined the NSDAP, where he was recognized as a valuable person. After all, the very nature of his schizophrenic swings was born on the basis of racial hatred, which was, on the contrary, appreciated by the Nazis who came to power. The prisoners from Dachau were not intended for gas chambers and crematoria. The bulk of the Jews were taken to the death factories of a different specialization, to the east. These were used as labor in enterprises, including factories which produced fabrics. More to add here, medical experiments were carried out on them, which led to the death of many of the prisoners. Only in 1943, crematoria appeared here. The Nazis, after their backs were broken, decided to burn their victims everywhere, trying to eliminate traces of the true scope of their crimes. The crematorium worked almost without a break. The bones were buried deeply into the ground. How many prisoners died in total in this camp? According to various expert estimates, from 70 to 243,000 people. And most importantly, you need to know how they died. More on this topic below. Watch carefully, otherwise you'll miss the key to understanding the essence of this episode. The Vilest Moments. To understand the reasons for what happened here in 1945, on the 29th of April, you need to at least briefly take into consideration what the Americans saw when they broke in on that day. What they saw was, rather, the result of what this section will be devoted to. In the preventive detention facility, that being a prison created for all, even hypothetical enemies of the regime, people were forced to work to death exhaustion. They were kept here in monstrous sanitary and in winter temperature conditions. More so, the guards, out of boredom or from the same racial hatred brought to schizophrenic intensity, mocked the prisoners on a daily basis. The camp for prisoners was connected by a checkpoint house to the barracks of the SS. Officers and ordinary guards, each of whom was also assigned the coordination of the performance of all kinds of economic duties. The fourth nightmarish moment, after the peculiarities of everyday life, impossible labor standards, and bullying of the guards, was the division of two heterogeneous people into two castes. Those who wanted to survive here were invited to engage in informing. The resistance could form in the camp at any given moment. Such people, under the guise of special tasks, were taken to the kitchen, where they ate heartily, and to the shower, where they could wash. Some could not resist cigars and schnapps. and therefore, because of the hard smell, they were quickly identified by the rest of the prisoners. They gave them the special nickname Capo and tried to finish them off at any convenient moment. But that's not all. The fifth nightmare of the camp was the day of arrival. Newcomers were led into an elongated distribution room, forcing them to strip naked. The oblong room was divided by a row of tables, at which the admission committee comfortably sat. Clothes and personal belongings were taken away by members of the team, made up of long-time prisoners. People were immediately made to understand that they were no one now, a biomass of individuals no different from each other. They were checked for lice and other infections. Their heads were entirely shaved, hosed over, and each was given a robe with a number. A person here lost old status, but not yet the status of a person proper. But the purpose of his further stay here was to further deform his personality, or rather, to depersonalize him altogether. Even during the distribution, the dead were screened out in one barrack. But the most terrific thing during their stay here was the punishments and executions. These certainly brought the dehumanization of the prisoner to the very end. Those who experienced punishment and torture and also saw executions began to think only about how to survive. Of course, there were those who managed to preserve at least some remnants of not only a person but also a man. It was on them that all the others, who knew that it was necessary to act, wound up on them. They became the coordinators of the resistance of each individual block and also barracks. But about the topic of resistance later. What were tortures, punishments, and executions like? First, each of these definitions, depending on the results, was suitable for medical experiments in one of the blocks. To begin with, hundreds of prisoners have turned into mice and frogs for inexperienced students, and more hardened doctors tested vaccines and medicines, making incisions and introducing infections there. Also the effect of X-rays on prisoners. Often, if it was a case of a teenager, he still had to have a good immunity, then he was placed with infected people who infected him naturally, by airborne droplets. Antibiotics were given already with obvious symptoms of tropical diseases. Crash tests were carried out on the special uniforms of pilots and divers, placing the unfortunates dressed in them in an ice bath for a very long time. And finally, Dr. Roche was generally interested in whether it was possible to frost once more a person who was already frozen to the point of blue and clinical death. There were experiments and transfusions of different blood types. Secondly, as an indication, disobedient prisoners were attached to poles by their wrists. They had sticks behind their backs, or even hung in this way from iron rafters. It was unbearably excruciating. Sometimes, at the same time in this position, they were also beaten. Thirdly, for minor misdoings, people were only flogged, but this was also painful and humiliating. Speaking of deaths, many unfortunates died during the death march, walking here from distant places. Someone was especially lucky if he died simply of hunger. He didn't wake up in the morning. Someone was shot on the spot during dangerous behavior, such as attempted assault or visible participation in the resistance, or sabotaging duties. As you understood, the lives of many were terminated in the process of torture and experiments, which were put on them by fanatical doctors. But only members of the resistance who were identified, sometimes with the help of traitors, prisoners, or other dangerous violators of the regime, were honored with mass public execution. They were hung with a sign around their necks. One of the things that Nazis liked to do quite often. The dead were not always burned completely. Alcoholized organs and bleached skeletons of many later served as teaching aids. Hair and leather were used to make household items, and fat was used to make soap. However, we can talk about the pragmatism of the Third Reich for a long time. Resistance and breakthrough of the Allied forces in Bavaria. The resistance gained momentum and effectiveness gradually. As the front approached Germany, the hopes of the prisoners increased more and more. Now, fewer and fewer prisoners wanted to sign up as traitors. The scales confidently tipped such hesitance either to refuse to cooperate with the Nazis or even to assist the resistance. In addition, in 1944-1945, the SS men, who felt their end, went wild and tried to deprive the prisoners not only of food, but also of water. People licked the floor, trying to suck at least a little moisture out of it, and if someone was punished here, they interrogated to death. The Nazis panicked. And at the end of April 1945, the concentration camp personnel, both regular soldiers and SS men, received an order to bring here and kill several times as many prisoners, and then have time to load them onto the death train, going to the camp with the largest number of crematoria. The leaders of the resistance advised the prisoners to calm down. not to sabotage the work, acts of vandalism, murder of personnel, and other types of violence. The liberators were close. It was necessary to save strength and not provoke the already enraged punishers. Only 42,000 prisoners waited for the glorious moment. This is 1/5, or maybe less, of the original composition. During the inclusion in hostilities, part of the 7th Allied Army, 45th Infantry Division of the United States, eventually reached the German state of Bavaria, and at the very end of April began to occupy settlements around its capital. By April 29th, it reached the town of Dachau and the death camp located near it. The highest leadership of the death factory knew about the approach of troops in advance. Which of the Nazis was not in the camp on the eve of Day X? In particular, the commander of the institution, SS Hauptsturmführer Martin Weiss, accompanied by a decent detachment of guards and an entire SS unit, left Dachau even before the American troops arrived here. Weiss, a former physics teacher, is known to historians of World War II as the head of the prison in Dachau, between the period of the factory and the concentration camp in 1933-1936 inclusive. There was an ordinary place of imprisonment here. Then he also became the head, respectively, of the concentration camp. Why change horses at the crossing? A base of the most loyal comrades in arms, which turned into a special local SS unit, and a Wehrmacht detachment assigned to them to protect it was formed around it. So they disappeared very timely, leaving SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker, who didn't suspect anything about the real deployment of the Americans, as the chief. He continued to quickly dispose of thousands of people, with the help of several teams of forced prisoners. But these guys already knew that the resistance members killed by that point all the capos. The behavior of the people in robes that day surprised Wicker very much. Under his command were 560 officers and privates of the SS overseers, soldiers of the disciplinary unit of the SS, also Hungarian infantrymen. In addition to these 560 people, there were some of the lower household servants, civilians. And when they heard shots and the riflemen turners falling from the towers, the SS men immediately understood what is going on. The Americans approached from the southwestern corner of the perimeter. Part of the SS, most daredevil Nazis, immediately entrenched themselves in one of the perimeter towers, but were destroyed by missiles. Surrender and negotiations. At 6:00 a.m., a new commandant in civilian clothes arrived in Dachau. The guy ordered all the camp employees to surrender. A parliamentarian was sent to the southwest corner, of course with a white flag. What happened? More precisely, there were several parliamentarians. The Americans met them 70 meters north of the southwest corner. The three men identified themselves as Swiss Red Cross spokesmen, Victor Maurer, and 2 employees. In fact, the same officer Wicker posed as a Swiss. He reported that he had arrived on the night of the 28th to take responsibility for the surrender of the concentration camp to American troops. The deceiver claimed that about 560 SS guards remained in the concentration camp, who absolutely all surrendered their weapons, except for those who were in one of the perimeter towers. They had already been killed. The pseudo-Swiss asked to avoid shooting and indicated that about 50 Americans would be needed to free the guards, surrounded by a crowd of prisoners, armed with crowbars and shovels. And by the way, he also warned that Americans need to know that some of the 42,000 prisoners are infected with typhus, so they should be careful. He then asked Harry Collins, "Are you an officer?" He immediately replied, "I'm the acting commander of the 42nd Infantry Division and will accept the surrender of the concentration camp to the United States Army." Did it seem to be alright for him? No. After all, the American soldiers, for their part, had seen thousands of corpses. There was a shock, and it needed explanation. Involuntary reprisals against the Nazis. 10:55 a.m. Camp Commandant Kadzienski went out to meet the American troops, but was killed in the ensuing battle. But why? He tried to surrender the camp on safe terms. All 3 parliamentarians were immediately shot. One of them, as we know, was Wicker. His cunning didn't help him. 11:00 a.m. Units of the 3rd Battalion of the 45th American Division entered the territory. Lieutenant William Walsh, commander of Company 1, 157th Infantry, shot 4 soldiers who declared their desire to surrender. They just had an SS uniform. Afterwards, Private Albert Pruitt entered the death car through the window and completed the massacre of the wounded SS men hiding there. Those are from the tower. Lieutenants Walsh and Bush divided prisoners of war into Wehrmacht soldiers and SS men. After that, the latter, SS men, were shot using various types of weapons. At the same exact time, the surviving prisoners, having mastered the entrenching tool, literally hacked to death with it everyone in Hitler's uniform who came across them, or 3 were hacked for 2 hours, with blows with shovels flat. There was clearly nowhere to hurry. In the end, 40 people were caught by the prisoners. Some American soldiers provided several prisoners with guns without orders. The disposal of the SS soldiers immediately gained a more intense speed. In the intervals between the stages of the massacre, the shutters of photojournalists worked and the cameras of TV documentaries who arrived with the army buzzed. That is, it is to them that you owe for the shots that you are now watching on your screens. 11:30 a.m. The Americans finally looked around the camp and saw piles many meters high. Piles of corpses in the death train. They were never taken out. Half-burned, half-dressed or completely undressed corpses on the territory. They are also in many rooms. In the barracks again, they lay in high heaps. Those who arrived saw torn bodies and blocks for medical experiments. Many Americans vomited. Under the effect of what they saw and what was already happening, American soldiers shot another 122 German prisoners, mostly those from the SS troops. 12:00 p.m. Order in the camp is restored. But, as it turns out, just temporarily. 358 German soldiers were taken prisoner according to all the rules, including several wounded brought here from the hospital at 6 a.m. by the new commandant. He thought the doctors were here, but they had already been killed by the prisoners. 12:05 p.m. An American machine gunner nicknamed Bird's Eye suddenly yelled, "They're trying to escape," and opened fire with a .30 caliber machine gun, killing a dozen more Nazis. Only then did Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks push him away, shouting in a hurry, "What are you doing?" 12:15 to 12:30 p.m. Calm silence returned, but again, temporary. Most of the strong prisoners finally returned to their barracks. Everyone satisfied their thirst for ultimate revenge. About 95% of the prisoners did not participate in the massacre, since they couldn't move at all, dying of thirst, hunger, beatings, and typhus. 14:45 p.m. Another 346 German prisoners were shot at the wall of Block C. At least one German soldier was killed by prisoners. He unexpectedly blew off half of his head with a shovel. It turned out that some of the Nazis, stuffed with bullets, begged for mercy or twitched while barely alive. They were finished off for a long time unscrupulously with single shots. 18:00 p.m. Additional forces arrived to guard the camp, which made a rotation. It seems that those Nazis who settled in the tower initially did not lose about the fate that awaited their comrades in arms. This group of National Socialists resisted to the last. The tower was pelted with grenades. The soldiers had more than enough of them. Tribunal concerning the remaining SS men. Only 40 SS survivors survived this epic massacre. They were deliberately kept in the same barracks, in the same unbearable conditions as their recent victims. But the trial of them took place in the most decent local room. The tribunal consisted of a group of US Army officers. There were plenty of witnesses and evidence. Consequently, the court's decision was expected: the immediate death penalty. The punishment for 36 functionaries is death. The sentence, hanging, was carried out in Lüneburg prison, but not for everyone. In relation to 8 of the SS men, the execution was commuted to life imprisonment. The head of the Consularary Service received a life sentence, as he was recognized as an indirect accomplice to the vilest atrocities described above. And finally, 3 Hungarians, perimeter guards who were not even allowed into the area where the massacres took place, were gifted with 10 years on a bunk. How their further fate developed is no longer known to descendants. While undoubtedly, the court at Dachau was the place where each of the Nazis who were here on April 29th received justice. The only thing that was unfair was the situation that made it possible for the SS men who had worked there before April 29th to slip away. Inspection of the massacre by a military tribunal. Was there a trial of those who tripled the massacre of the remaining concentration camp personnel on the day of its liberation? Of course, it wasn't about prisoners. After all, everyone was in a state of affect at that time. They were dehumanized by the Nazis themselves, including doctors who paid for the experiment with their lives. As a result of the investigation conducted by the American Military Tribunal against the participants in the massacre, including Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks and Colonel Howard Buchner, significant charges were brought against them. No one even hid anything about the orders from Sparks and Buchner. Soldiers and junior officers knew that they would not be punished anyway, since everyone participated in the massacre in one way or another. The military said that neither the first nor the second forced them to do anything. Everything then happened situationally, as if by itself. As a result of such verdict, General George Patton, who was appointed governor of Bavaria and concurrently the head of the tribunal, literally speaking, insistently asked military prosecutors to wipe themselves with their papers, in this case indictment materials. At this point, the trial of the participants in the massacre was completed. On June 8, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker issued a document known as the IG Report, which was titled An Investigation into the Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau. In the year 1991, an archival version of it was discovered in the US National Archives and made available to the public. In fact, this is essentially where all these details came from. In response, Büchner wrote his memoirs, Dachau, The Hour of the Avenger, Eyewitness Testimony. Reflection of events in cinema. The film Shutter Island is full of nightmares of the main character, former US Federal Marshal Edward Daniels. In 1954, a former American serviceman is sent to investigate the disappearance of a female child killer named Rachel Solando. He has regular headaches, and since he meets a German doctor who looks like bloody concentration camp experimenters in white coats on an island with a mental hospital, the night horrors are even worse. The German served as a trigger for a more detailed recollection of the events in which Edward took part, meaning the massacre that we are discussing here. Daniels now intends to find laboratories in which experiments on people are carried out. He first saw them back then, in Dachau. He is full of extreme dedication to subject matter and determination. The plot of this tape is very confusing but dynamic. This film has a truly heavy atmosphere, and after watching, it leaves a feeling of discomfort and melancholic anguish. There is a hint of a larger dilemma for us. Can a soldier kill those who in any case deserve to die for war crimes that have already been identified prior? Let everyone give the answer to this hard question for themselves. In any case, this became a history. Thank you for watching our episode on X-War history. If you want to watch other episodes we have, click on the screen. Also, subscribe and leave a like. Help this channel grow, and see you in our upcoming episodes.